On today's episode, we examine the transformation the Labour Party undertook after the conclusion of the World War, the extension of the vote, and the 1918 coupon general election. All that and more on this episode of the History of the Labour Party. Britain emerged from the First World War victorious but changed. The same could be said for the country's unions and labour movements. As we spoke about last time, the War Emergency Workers' National Committee, or WNC, brought organised labour into the heart of government. But the organisation also lobbied for a state that was more involved in economic and industrial matters. This had become inevitable whilst the country was on a war footing, but once planted, such ideas wouldn't simply fade away once the war had ended. Unions had also become stronger during the war, not just in terms of increased credibility or access to government process, but trade union membership itself had increased from around 25% of the workforce to 38% by the end of the war. The unions had become more powerful within the country, but this paled in comparison to the dominance with which they now held over the Labour Party and its happenings. Yet despite this, they allowed the Labour Party to try and transform itself, to turn itself from an organisation that only represented the narrow interests of different unions into a legitimate national party. However, this was a task that was easier said than done. The party was still heavily reliant on the unions, not just for financial support, but also for foot soldiers. Yet the party needed to focus on issues that reflected not just union concerns, but the electorate's concerns. The unions would always hold a certain amount of influence over the Labour Party, but how much was the right amount? That's a question that the Labour Party began asking itself pretty much straight away, and it still asks itself today. With so many different concerns by all involved parties, it speaks to the diplomatic skills of the Labour Party leadership that they were able to allay fears and get the party's new constitution and programme approved, even if it did take 2 attempts. Whilst we won't look at it in detail just yet, it was in this constitution that the later infamous Clause 4 was written. The clause committed Labour to securing for producers by hand and by brain the full fruits of their industry, upon the basis of common ownership of the means of production. We'll be speaking about this a lot more in the future, as it would come to define the fundamental divide between Labour's 2 broad factions. But coming out of the party's conference in 1918, there was a possibility, however slight, that the Labour Party could become a real national party. There were 3 main reasons for this. The first was that the Labour Party had differentiated itself from its rivals, setting out its vision for Britain. The party's first programme criticised what it called the individualist system of capitalist production. The party called for an end of the monstrous inequality of circumstances which it produces and the degradation and brutalisation, both moral and spiritual, that it inflicted. Finally, the programme committed the Labour Party to burying the old system, and I quote, "with the millions of whom it has done to death." Pretty strong stuff, but it remained to be seen whether such a radical position, given that it was 1918, would be successful electorally. However, this proposal came on the back of the 1918 Representation of the People Act. This piece of legislation extended the vote to all men over 21 and to most women over the age of 30. It would take another 10 years before the act was extended to all women who were 21 years of age or over. Surely this new wave of voters, most of them working class, would be tempted by Labour's vision of a different and fairer, more equitable future for all. The third and final reason why Labour had a chance to break into what had always been a 2-party system was because of the split within the Liberal Party, which was still going strong. In the upcoming general election, the Liberals would split between the traditional Liberals, led by Asquith, and the coalition Liberals, led by Lloyd George. The official armistice with Germany was signed on the 11th of November 1918, with the general election being organised for as soon as possible after that, eventually being held on the 14th of December. This wasn't just the first election since the start of the war, but also the first election in which women could legally stand as parliamentary candidates. This followed the passing of the Parliament Qualification of Women Act. Electorally, the results for Labour in terms of seats wasn't great. Despite standing in 361 constituencies, the party won just 57 of those. What's more, two of Labour's most important leaders, MacDonald and Henderson, both lost their seats. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. In terms of vote share, the party came second, winning just over 20% of the vote. Not bad for a party that had been in existence for less than 2 decades. But as we will discuss in what will probably be its own special couple of episodes, the voting system of the UK, first past the post, means that your percentage of the total nationwide vote, well, that isn't what matters. Indeed, it's possible to win fewer votes than your opponent, yet still gain more seats. This happened in 1951 and again in 1974. Whilst there are pros and cons to every electoral system, many have pointed out that in the UK, first past the post often works poorly for progressive parties. But let's save that rabbit hole for another time. Despite winning less seats than Sinn Féin, Labour ended up being the largest party on the opposition benches. This was due to Sinn Féin's refusal to take up its seats in Britain's Parliament. This would help Labour to secure its place as Her Majesty's royal opposition. But what helped Labour the most in this election was the split between the Liberals. The 1918 general election is sometimes called the coupon election, because Lloyd George, who was in coalition with the Conservatives going into the election, endorsed candidates via letters, which Asquith would brand coupons. In the end, Lloyd George's coalition Liberals won 127 seats, whilst Asquith's traditional Liberals won just 36. All of this cleared the way for a huge 152-seat majority for the Conservative and coalition Liberal government. Whilst Labour had made progress, especially when it came to its national vote share, it's clear that the party still had a long way to go before it would be capable of forming its own administration. Join me next week as we continue following Labour's progress towards that goal of governing. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, then please do share and get in touch, either on Twitter at History of Labour, or send us an email at historyofthelabourparty@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you all next week.